Today is May 30th, 2014. We're at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer with the History Center. And with me is Ed Woods, who is also a volunteer at the History Center, and Sue Verhoff, who is the senior archivist at the History Center. We're honored to have with us today Mr. Tom Ross. Mr. Ross is a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he's agreed to come share his story with us. And this is part of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and his story will be put on record with the History Center and with the Library of Congress. Mr. Ross, we really appreciate you coming in, and we're looking forward to hearing about your experiences and your life.
Absolutely, my pleasure to be here.
Would you state your full name and your current address, please?
Thomas A. Ross, 5710 Mount Repose Lane, Peachtree Corners, Georgia.
Okay. Where and when were you born?
I was born December the 29th, 1945 in Huntington, West Virginia.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Mine was pretty much an American story. I carried rocks and frogs in my pocket, like any good little boy. All American. I was a Cub Scout, Boy Scout, Eagle Scout. I loved being in the woods. My grandfather, who was one of the great loves of my life, taught me to hunt and fish in the West Virginia hills. My dad worked retail, so he was often gone a lot. But when he was home, he'd flown with the 8th Air Force and flew over Germany. And actually, we shot down over Germany. The plane made it to Belgium before it crash landed, and the French underground got him out. My mom was born in Proctorville, Ohio, which is just across the river from Huntington, and her grandfather was the town marshal there. So men in my life were responsible characters. My grandfather, the one that taught me to hunt and fish, was a metallurgist and worked with International Nickel there in Huntington, and they produced different metals for a lot of the equipment that was used during the war. So that was.
Did your dad talk about his experiences at all in World War II?
He did, and they were, for a young person, interesting. The flights over Europe, how cold it was when they flew, being attacked by German fighter planes. I love those stories. In fact, one of my great memories as a boy, my dad was handy with wood, and he flew. Well, he and my mom had both attended Marshall University in Huntington, and my dad was a part of the flight program there. So he would carve B-17s. So that's what we'd do in the evening. We'd make B-17s, and so as a child, I have great memories of growing up. We lived in Huntington till I was about 8 or 9, and then my dad, who was at that time in the jewelry industry, relocated to Pensacola, Florida. So we were at the home of naval flight, which was interesting. And I can remember prior to Vietnam, and I think a lot of people look for justification for the war. Why did we get involved? For me, living on the Gulf Coast in the 60s easily takes me to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I can remember rocket batteries set up on a sugar white sand beach where they shouldn't have been. And that was 1962. And so it was only a few years later that I wound up enlisting to do Vietnam duty.
Talk about your enlistment, what your motivation was, what your family's attitude was towards you enlisting, and what your why you did it at the time?
Very easy one, very easy one. I was in college at the time, the University of West Florida is there in Pensacola, and at that point my dad had started the family business, and while I was in school, I changed majors 5 times, at least 5. I was actually majoring in sorority, and it was a Sunday evening where I was having dinner at my parents' house. The Friday evening before, we'd had a joint sorority fraternity party, and I was watching the evening news, and a report came on that showed 2 young Marines dragging another one out of the line of fire. It was incredible the way that affected me. It was as if I had been hit by a bolt of lightning or had a bucket of ice water dumped on me. All of a sudden, I was terribly embarrassed that I wasn't where those young men were. I instantly felt compelled to join the service, not just to join the service. I felt compelled to go to Vietnam. So the next day, I was at the enlistment office. I really wanted to fly, but without having completed a college degree at that point, nobody would talk to me but the Army. The options were I could go fixed wing or rotor, but I had to take a flight school test, and I had to pass physical exam. So I reported to the test area. I guess there were about 250 of us in the room that took the test. I think that test was given in Montgomery. And I believe about 12 of us passed the test. They loaded us the next morning into vans and took us to Fort Rucker, Alabama for a flight physical. I'll never forget that. It's the first time I'd ever had anybody put drops in my eyes, and I was instantly blinded and couldn't see for about 2 hours. And I think the doctor finally just wanted to get rid of me. I'd passed every other part. He said, go. I guess it was about a week later, I got a call from the recruiter. He said, you're in. We're planning to schedule a flight school date for you, and it's 90 days away. And I said, wait just a minute. I said, why is it 3 months? He said, well, what they're doing is they are giving the closer dates to people who are already in the service, who would like to go to flight school, and so you'll be attending in 3 months. I said, you know what? I really need to go now. I said, I don't want to sit and wait 3 months. And he said, well, I can't guarantee you OCS, but based on your flight school tests, you'll have no problem with the OCS test. But the hook is you have to enlist. I can't give you that test here. You can only take it after you've entered the service. So I said, I'll see you tomorrow. We'll sign the papers. 3 days later, I was in Fort Polk, Louisiana, an amazing place. Inhabited primarily by alligators and birds of many species.
And this was 1966, right?
1966,
Okay.
yes.
Sorry.
So I've had the opportunity to visit with high school students and college students, and it's something that happened to me in this process that I point out to them. If you want to succeed, you must focus. Prior to this, I didn't have a lot of focus. You know, life is going to unfold and it'll be whatever it is. But I now knew what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go, and I knew I wanted to survive the experience. It wasn't just this blind, I want to pick up a gun and go. Because the strange thing was, I wanted to go do something positive. I wasn't sure what that was, or how it would define itself, if I would even recognize it when it occurred. but I was going. So I did, took the OCS test 3 days after I arrived and passed, was given a date. Now at that time they were drafting, and so I had to go through basic training, infantry basic training. Infantry basic training was 8 weeks, and there were people in that class, because they were drafting, who already had college degrees. I think there were 2 guys with masters, and I think there was one with a PhD or some advanced degree. Anyway, this is to the focus point. I graduated number 1 scholastically. As a result of that, they sent me to a leadership school in California, Fort Ord. I graduated number 1 in the class and as honor graduate. Now this is from somebody who before had been demonstrating lackluster capabilities. But as I said, I wanted to survive the experience, and so I paid attention. They sent me, after leadership school, they did in fact assign me to an AIT, Advanced Infantry Training Unit. I was there 2 weeks, and they sent me on to OCS. OCS was an experience. You received basic infantry training and leadership, so on and so forth. For me, I love the follow me idea, because for me, a leader, you don't lead from behind, you lead from out front, and out front was going to be where things were happening. Interesting that when you're in that situation, even though you know, and this is an experience that I'm guessing the 2 of you all may have had, it's always the other guy that you believe will die. It's not you. And actually that's probably a good thing, because I don't think you could do the job if every minute you thought you were going to die. Anyway, at OCS, you were to determine which branch of the service you wanted to serve in. And there was artillery and infantry and so on and so forth. Special Forces hadn't been around that long, but again, hoping to survive the experience, I thought, how do you do that? And you do that by being as well trained as you can be. And I thought, got to be these guys. So I applied. Well, actually, I went over, there was a recruiting office on Fort Benning. And I went over and talked to this old sergeant who looked as though he'd probably been in a couple Indian wars. Forget Korea or Vietnam or any place else. I mean, I expected to see arrows sticking out of him. I said, Sarge, I'm thinking about joining. And he said, I had on my OCS uniform, so he said, you're going to be a young lieutenant soon, aren't you? And I said, I am. He said, well, as a matter of fact, we're loaded with lieutenants. He said, we get people coming over here every day. He said, John Wayne just did a movie titled The Green Berets. And he said, everybody wants to be a Green Beret. I said, I'd like to be a Green Beret, but I'd rather survive Vietnam. And he looked at me, he said, I'll tell you what. He said, go ahead and take this application. He said, fill it out and bring it back over to me tomorrow. So I took the application back to my room, and I looked over it, and it's the standard, your name and address and service to this point. But there were 10 listings of countries, if you were chosen, where would you choose to serve? It was all over the world. Italy was even on there. I love Italy. Number 10 was Vietnam, and then there were 2 empty blanks under that. I checked the Vietnam block and wrote Vietnam in the next 2, and I thought they're either going to think I'm a Section 8 and they'll direct me to a doctor nearby, or they'll think I'm very dedicated. And wasn't 10 days later, I received, it came in the mail, an acceptance for Special Forces training. So I graduated from OCS immediately. The next day, went across the street to jump school went through jump training because that was a requirement of Special Forces training. And 2 weeks after that, I was at Fort Bragg and began Special Forces training.
Talk about that Special Forces training. And this was the early days of the Special Forces and what that was like.
So different than it is now. Similar, but the difference is you had to know how to use a compass. Forget GPS, where now they pull out a GPS device and they can direct artillery to any point on the face of the earth. It was exceptional, it was in-depth, and it lasted for me a year. You do the standard mountain climbing, you climb rocks, and you go out. Doesn't make any difference what's happening weather-wise. If it's raining, if it's snowing, you're out there. And for me, having grown up in the Northwest Florida woods, I mean, my mother would have to blow a whistle at night in order to get me home out of the woods because I was out there building a tree house or a fort or something. So I loved it. And again, it was I wanted to learn. There wasn't too much to learn, but some of the training was interesting. It was on nuclear weapons and every weapon that you might encounter. They would often, part of the training would be, you're in a dark room, they hand you a weapon, tell you to take it apart, put it back together, and give it to them so that they can go outside and test fire it and see if it actually functions. Because I was an officer, there are 5 Special Forces specialties that Special Forces soldiers are trained in. Typical A team has 12 men, 2 officers and 10 enlisted men. Each man is cross-trained so that if somebody goes down, he can pick up, another man can pick up that skill level. That's light weapons, heavy weapons, demolitions, communications, and first aid. The officers got training in all of that. The medical training to me was the most fascinating because they taught us to do what is called a surgical cut down, and that if somebody is down and the veins are depressed and you can't find them in the arm or any place else, you go in between these 2 tendons on the foot and you can actually feel it. There's a vein in there. You go in through the skin, cut the vein in, not through, but in half, insert the tube up that, and that's how you deliver plasma. I particularly enjoyed the explosives training. I mean, you worked with C4, det cord, I mean, pretty much every explosive that is out there. So the training was fascinating. They sent me to Army Intelligence School in Fort Holabird, Maryland, because my regular assignment when I wasn't training was as the intelligence officer of a company with 3rd Special Forces Group stationed there at Fort Bragg. This training was amazing. They would teach you interrogation techniques. They would teach you homework assignment one night. They handed me a ring that must have had a dozen different locks on it. And after the day's training, the assignment was to come back the next morning with all of your locks off the hoop. So you had to be able to open all the locks. They had a safe, a large vault, and I'm looking around because I'm looking for the one that's at my store, and it's not here. But it was plexiglass, and they would show you how it worked, how to open a vault. They showed you, it was a piece of coal. It was molded to look like coal, but it was actually explosive. And that was old European, because what you do with that is throw it up in a coal car of an enemy train, and they shovel it into the boiler, and the boiler blows up. So there were just all kinds of things. But the most fascinating part of that training was the interrogation techniques. It's the only place in the government, other than at higher levels, where there are actually actors employed. And they dressed like North Vietnamese soldiers, guards, civilians, and you were taught different techniques, which for me later became indispensable. That training, whatever they spent on that was made well worth it during one episode of my time in Vietnam. So really, really very interesting. The medical training, as I said, it was all, especially for a young man. Give a young man explosives and guns and.
Now, did you go from Fort Holabird to Vietnam, or did you have any
No,
stops? in
I
between?
went back to Fort Bragg and was there, I guess, another few months. Completed all of the training because you're doing book work as well. There are map courses, and on one of the map courses, interesting to mention, but they would, when you show up the map course, you were typically assigned three-man teams. And one person was to operate the compass and walk out front, and the next was to count steps and such, and another one had a small piece of cord that he was to tie knots into every time you went a certain distance so that you would know how far you traveled. Now, this was before Special Forces training, because the Special Forces training was far more sophisticated. But this one was amusing to me. Anyway, I got up to the front of the line. It was my turn, and there were a couple guys behind me. They would just, as you appeared, they would break you off. Another old sergeant. And I said, "Sarge, I've been thinking about this. What are the odds that I'm going to be captured or stranded in the middle of nowhere with two guys, one that's going to have his compass and one that's going to be able to tie knots? Can I run this course by myself?" And he said, "So you just want to do it on your own?" I said, "To me, if something happens, more likely than not, I could be alone." And he said, "You're right. Here's your number. Take off." And I did. It was, pitch black at night. We didn't start till after dark, and the course, I think, is 11 miles long. And along the way, they had aggressor units out there. I encountered some character who jumped up in front of me in the middle of the dark and yelled, "Halt." Well, what they did tell us was that if you're captured, they do have a prisoner of war camp. They will take you there, and they do have light torture. And it's all part of the training, blah, blah, blah. Well, even as a training exercise, I didn't feel like I was ready for torture. So what I know is this guy doesn't have live rounds in this weapon he's pointing at me. So I turned around and I headed off into the night. And I was running full speed, going through brush, briars, everything. Finally, I just stopped and dropped down. And he knew that I'd stopped running, so he did too, but he was pretty good ways behind me. Well, he kept walking. And he said, "I know where you are. I know you're out there. I can see you." And I thought, well, if you see me, you're going to come stick that in my ear. And so I knew he didn't know where I was. Well, about that time, another group of three walked. They walked so close to me, I could have reached out and touched them. And they walked right past me and right into this guy. And he started firing his blank gun, and they're running and screaming and everything. But just an interesting episode that from that, then you get to the Special Forces level where you are taught to escape and evade as if your life depended on it, which it did back in the other training. But when you're out there as a Special Forces advisor, it's very, very different atmosphere. So from there, I got my assignment to go. Well, was ordered to the 5th Group in Vietnam, but didn't have my assignment. Didn't know what I'd be doing until I got there. And it was interesting flying into the country. I saw this on the sheet. It was one of the questions. What were your thoughts as you flew in? And flying in, I mean, it looked like you were flying into any other country. In my head, I had imagined something from one of the old John Wayne movies, a dark, very foreboding atmosphere. And it wasn't that at all. It's beautiful. The sand around, I flew into Cameron Bay, reminded me a lot of my home in Pensacola. And I was there a day or two and then helicoptered to Nha Trang, and it was that flight along the coast that we flew over water that looked like it could be in Jamaica or the Bahamas. Absolutely gorgeous, crystal clear. You could see coral heads, and it just not at all what I had imagined. I mean, it was lush, it was green, it was beautiful. And we landed at the Nha Trang airstrip, and I went into the radio room and asked if they would let somebody at 5th Group know I was there. And when I sat, had my duffel bag, I turned it over and sat down on it, waiting for my ride, and looking around, everything just, it smelled different. I mean, it was Asian food. You could hear Vietnamese soldiers, officers directing men to work in what was now a very foreign language. So now, this place that I'd wanted to get to, I was there. And so it ran through my head, are you really ready to be here? And is this really where you want to be? So I reflected over the last couple years of training. And in the end, I thought, I can't be better prepared than I am. And yes, this is where I want to be. And that alone was very comforting to me, that I had that level of comfort with my training. And quite frankly, they had done a very good job. I don't know what I would have changed. So Jeep showed up to take me to 5th Group headquarters, and we are on the way. Oh, the interesting thing, certainly noteworthy, I arrived during Tet of 1968. I'd been at Cameron Bay and missed the front few days. So Nha Trang, the roads, there were barriers here and there throughout the city. And on the ride over, we encountered a Vietnamese unit. They thought they had a couple VC suspects in a burned out house. And so the road was blocked, and we pulled up and stopped. Well, they started firing into the house, and when they did, the bullets started ricocheting, and now they're hitting all around us in the Jeep. And I told the young driver who had his M16 next to him in the Jeep, I said, let's get out of here. So we rolled out of the Jeep, around the Jeep, and are standing up in a doorway as this continues. And my thought was, I haven't even been assigned to a weapon yet, and I don't want to be killed unarmed. I want to go down fighting if I'm going to go. But so that ended, and we went over to headquarters, and I lined up to receive my orders. And the young JAG Spec 4 handed him to me, said, "This you're going to like this team." He said, "You've been assigned as the S2 and S3 officer of A502. Well, as soon as I heard that, it didn't make sense. A teams don't have an intelligence officer and an operations officer. Those positions are normally each filled by a captain, and they're at C team level." And I said, "So is this?" He said, "You'll understand when you get there." And what I came to understand was that A502, where I'd been assigned, was the largest Special Forces A team ever to exist. At our height during 1968, we had 55 men. And normally, as I said, an A team has 12 men. A502 had at least 5 or 6 outposts and was responsible for the defense of Nha Trang City and the northern approach to Cam Ranh Bay. Nha Trang City was where 5th Special Forces Group headquarters were. Now you stop and think about that. 55 men are assigned to defend, forget 2 cities, 1 city. Well, we had indigenous troops that were assigned to us. And I think at 502 we had 3,000. But CIDG is Irregular Defense Group, which means the guy off the street, the farmer out of the field. So I knew immediately it was going to be an interesting year, which it was. It was a year for which I would take nothing. I wouldn't trade that experience. I met such incredible men and women during that year in Vietnam that it is one of the reasons I was prompted to write the book later. Well, within 3 days, forget 3 days, my first night at A502, because we were still sorting out Tet and what exactly had happened and what it meant to the United States, I was assigned to Buddha Hill with one of the units. Buddha Hill was in near Nha Trang and overlooked the city, so it was a great observation point. It was a point that the enemy had held for a time, and it was called Buddha Hill because there was a giant statue of Buddha atop this little knoll, and it was white and was probably 50 or 60 feet high. When it got dark that evening, everything changed. It looked to me like a Hollywood set for a movie. It was a beautiful night in Vietnam. The sky was crystal clear, so when the sun started to set, you'd see the oranges and reds and blues and purples, and these reflected off that big white statue. It was amazing. Nha Trang sits right on the South China Sea, so there was a gentle breeze off the South China Sea, but otherwise it was still. And there was this gong from a Buddhist temple somewhere, gong, and it would echo across the valley. It was amazing. I mean, I hadn't been there one day, and I thought this, certainly every day can't be like this. But as the night wore on, then the North Vietnamese units that were still in and around, the VCs started moving around, and you could hear gunfire here, you could hear gunfire over there, the sound of a mortar, illumination flares, which gave an eerie orange glow to the night. I mean, shadows as these things moved. You could imagine, you could see enemy soldiers marching up the hill. Your imagination played many tricks on you. So it was a great night of learning. And one of the team sergeants, I wasn't up there by myself, another young officer who had arrived with me and 2 seasoned team members. But we broke up and placed ourselves at different points on the hill. And during the night, one of these old sergeants wandered over and he said, "You hear that? Those are AK-47s. That's an enemy unit." You could tell by the distinct crack of these weapons who had what, who was firing AKs, who had carbines, which was typically the Vietnamese, M16s, so there had to be some Americans involved. And that night took a very long time to pass. as I laid my position, and I'd look down the hill, and you can look too hard and you will see things move. But so that's a night, my first night in Vietnam was a sensory extravaganza. After that night, everything tended to level out and become as routine as being in a special forces role can become. 3 days later, the team, which is normally commanded by a captain, this one was commanded by a major because of the number of people. And he came and grabbed me. He said, "Lieutenant Ross," he said, "we're going out on a mission. Grab your gear. I want you to observe this one, because now I am this team's." They hadn't had an operations or intelligence officer prior to this. They had an intelligence sergeant and an operations sergeant. But the major wanted to grow the team. He wanted more area, more responsibility. And so he was growing the team. So we mount this helicopter, and I guess there were probably about 6. So there was 1 or 2 platoons of soldiers, and we began out over the Vietnamese countryside. And I had a map, so I'm keeping track. Okay, here's the camp. And so I'm tracing this as we move out. And then something interesting began to happen. We started crossing over our path, and I thought immediately, somebody's lost, or they're not sure where they're going, because this is certainly not the way I would go in. That happened for a short while. The major's sitting next to me. He's not saying anything to me. He's just on the radio back and forth with the pilot and the other helicopters. And all of a sudden, he becomes extremely angry and very vocal and yells, "Take us back to camp." We landed back to camp, and I jumped down. I said, "We got lost, didn't we?" He said, "We sure did." He said, "Don't put his finger in my face. Don't ever let this happen to you." Well, that's all I had to hear. And for the next week, I called in observation missions every day and flew our entire area of responsibility until I knew it without the map. I'd tell the pilot, I'd put the map down and say, "Okay, I'm going to sit back here and close my eyes. Take me someplace, and then I'll take you back to camp." He'd call me on the radio, "Okay, you ready? Look out the door and tell me which way to go." And I did. And that served not just myself, but it served the team. And so.
You were flying in a Huey helicopter, I assume?
Yes. Go ahead. Prompt me with a question while I regroup here.
What was the morale like of your men at the time?
Among the Special Forces folks, it takes, and this is something interesting about my entire tour in Vietnam, I felt like a third-person observer because I'd watch people. It was just interesting to me, to reactions. And not speaking about myself, but about those I met at the team and other Special Forces folks since. You must be extremely motivated to join that unit. Because you're called upon to do things that are at times extraordinary. And if you're not motivated, one of 2 things will happen. You'll fail or die. Well, there's a third. You'll succeed. And hopefully that's the outcome. But nobody ever spoke, and this was 1968. It was the year Martin Luther King was killed, Bobby Kennedy was killed, the Democratic National Convention. All these horrible things were occurring, but these men only looked forward. Morale was exceptional. There was just no talk. What's our mission? And if our mission is to defend these cities, to kill enemy soldiers, that's what they were going to do. And to that end, every night somebody was assigned to ambush duty. And typically 2 Americans would accompany Vietnamese units as advisors. And we probably had anywhere from 6 to 12, 15 men out on ambush, not counting those who were at remote outposts. And those were typically manned by 2 or 3 Americans with a unit of Vietnamese. I quickly decided I needed to make friends, that one of the ways with my goal to survive this experience was to make friends. So when I knew I was going to be in the field, for example, I went to there was an American artillery unit. And my thinking was, if I call these guys in the middle of the night, it's not to say, are you guys sitting around playing cards? What are you doing? My call was, I need artillery and I need it right now. I wanted them to know me. I didn't want them firing for bunkhouse 02, which was my call sign. When they ran in the middle of the night to that gun, I wanted them to be firing not for Lieutenant Ross, that's Tom out there. And these were privates and sergeants, they were enlisted men. But I knew my life could depend on the speed and accuracy with which they did their job. So I'd go out, I'd go to the PX and get cookies and candy and thing, and take it out and say, hi, just, how are you, can I watch a fire mission? And I wanted them to know me, and I'd invite them over to the camp. Come on, we're cooking. It was amazing. You think of Special Forces folks roughing life, which they do very often, but when they have the opportunity, life is very good. We were in an old Vietnamese fort that the French had used when they were there, and we had a cook that had been trained by the French. He made some of the best gravies, sauces I've ever eaten in my life. So we lived life very well when we could. But when I'd go out, there was a screen door at the end. I was in kind of a Quonset hut, and we had sandbags around it. When I'd go out that screen door every morning, some mornings, it didn't occur to me every day, but that when that screen door slapped shut behind me, occasionally I'd wonder, am I going to go back through it this evening? Mm-hmm. So in your head, those thoughts are there, yeah. But you can't dwell on them. The only time there was one particular mission that I will never forget, that I thought, there's a chance I may not come back from this one. It was an assault into the Dongbu Mountains, which hover above Nha Trang, just west of Nha Trang City. Every other unit that had been up in there, we knew there was a large enemy unit up there, and that they were probably living in a cave complex. But every other unit that had been up there had been run out with heavy casualties. So I knew that going in, I was going as the backup. The Vietnamese major was going, and our leadership had just changed. We had a new major. He didn't really know the area, so I was going with him as second because I did know the area. Well, prior to this mission, I grew up Catholic. I decided I needed to take a ride to the city, found the Catholic priest, did confession, everything I felt I needed to do. I was going to leave my soul to God, and taking care of my body was going to be up to me. But something amazing. Every other unit had gone in by foot and climbed the mountain. My decision on this one was to go in 3/4 of the way up by helicopter, and rather than fighting our way up, fight our way down. So that's what we did. From the instant my boot hit the side of that mountain, my mortality never entered my mind until the morning we came out. You become so focused on the job that you don't consider all of the other alternatives. Well, the first night up there, this major, we had camped. We were fairly certain we would make contact because we had a North Vietnamese soldier with us who had come from that complex. And supposedly he was to lead us to the base camp. And so the first night we camped, the major and I were in this cave, and he happened to be laying there, and he was looking at some rocks above his legs, and he said, I wonder if that one's the Keystone Rock. And he kicked it, and it was the Keystone Rock, and all the others fell on his legs. So I had to have him flown out. So now I became the primary advisor for this operation. We hunted for 3 days, and never. We would make, our patrols would make contact, they'd see somebody or something, but it was never an all-out firefight. And after 3 days, we came out. Later, we had captured a prisoner near the base of the mountains who was leading a unit in for supplies. This is probably a week later. And during an interrogation, discovered that the Vietnamese in the mountain, and ultimately it was determined that there were between 600 and 700 troops up there. Our unit had 250. It would have been, I mean, no, we could have called in air support, blah, 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 but we had bombed that mountain. I'd fired artillery into that mountain many times myself. They backed down into those caves. You'd have to take off the entire top of that mountain to get at them. Anyway, they thought we had more soldiers than we had with us because they saw the helicopters. There was a lot of daily support. So they didn't realize what we had. But it's units like the ones that took us in, the ones that supported us. While we were up there that 3 days, the U.S. and the Vietnamese government really wanted the war to be run by the Vietnamese. They wanted them handling the heavy load. But there were times when they simply weren't up to the task. We needed a resupply. We'd been up there. We were out of food because we went in light intentionally so we could move swiftly. And so I think we may have only had 1 or 2 rations. The Vietnamese came in for resupply, got to within about 30 feet of the ground and just shoved the water bladders and water cans out. They hit the rocks, burst immediately, so we had no water. Sardine cans, and when the sardine cans hit, there was just enough pressure on them that there were sardines all over the top of this. It was an absurd sight. Finally, we called, the next day, I called one of the American units. There was an incredible unit that supported us, was the 281st Assault Helicopter Company. These guys were heroes and did things that I didn't think could be done. Certainly things I know shouldn't be done. For our water resupply, we needed to clear an area for them to get in, so we took explosives and literally blew a hole in the jungle. We used everything we had, and the hole, I guess, was about 60, maybe 70 feet in diameter. And the first helicopter showed up over this hole, and I was at the bottom of it, and he said, okay, he said, back out of the way. I'm coming down. And he started down, and as he did, he's clipping tree branches on either side. I said, you know what? Radioed him back. I said, you're not going to make it. I said, you know, it's not worth your life to get us water. And he said, no, just give me another try. And I watched as this guy brought this helicopter down inside that hole. Now, when we'd blown the trees, they had fallen. It wasn't flat land. Not only did he make it down in, he had to hover across a huge tree that was down, but it was long enough that we had several soldiers who had gotten sick because during the night, without water, they had decided they were going to make coffee out of urine, and they drank it and became instantly ill. So we put them on the chopper, unloaded the water, he took off, and the next guy showed up. I think there were 3 of them that came down inside that hole, and had they varied 3 feet, I would have been witness as that Huey tore itself apart. These are the kinds of things I witnessed that you don't hear about. Yeah. It's the story about killing babies or burning villages and blah, blah. And certainly those things happen. My Lai is a perfect example, horrible example. Unfortunately, horrible things happen during war. But there were so many good things. The artillery people who fired, they defended us. There are probably a handful of nights that I was in Vietnam that I will never forget. And one was a night that my best friend at A502, his name was Lieutenant Bill Phelan, he was out on an ambush. And I was the duty officer that night, which meant if one of our units got into contact, I would handle resupply, artillery, whatever they needed. And the radio man at about, I guess, 1 in the morning came running back. Lieutenant Ross, Lieutenant Phelan's in contact. So I jumped up, I'm barely awake, bouncing off the wall on the way to the radio room, and get into the radio room, and after every unit got in position at night, they would call in their coordinates. So I could look up on the map and I could see exactly where he was. So I picked up the radio and called him. He was Blue Bandit 06. No answer. I tried 3 or 4 more times, no answer. Now, you could go to our door and hear, you could hear that there was a battle going on not far away, and that was his unit. So I called one more time, and he recognized my call sign. Now, he had been an NCO before he'd been an officer, so Bill was a seasoned soldier. I knew when he responded, he believed he was going to die, because he came back in the clear. It wasn't Bunkhouse 02, this is Blue Bandit 06, here's our situation. In the clear, he said, Tom, we're not going to make it out of here. His ambush unit was a light platoon, about 20 men. They had ambushed a company-sized unit that was firing Russian B-40 rockets at them. And every time he fired the mic, it sounded like a war was going on. So I got back to him. I said, are you still where you set up? Yes. Stand by. Out. I told the radio man. I took a grease pencil. And this is, I was trained to do this. If I'd attempted to do this before I'd been trained, no way could I've done it. I would have been a babbling crybaby. But at that instant, all of the training, it's amazing how it comes into clarity and focus. I drew one line around on the one side, another one. Essentially, I built a 3-sided box. And I told the radio man, I said, call this set of guns and give them this set of coordinates for a fire mission. I called, the Koreans were on the other side of the river. I called them and gave them one set of coordinates, and I called in Nha Trang City and gave them a set of coordinates. One set of guns were 175s firing from Ninh Hoa, which was 25 kilometers away. When those things hit the ground, I think the burst radius is 200 yards. So it's a big area, and you have to be very careful. Each of those units, as we called in, would ask, do you want first round smoke? Because you always fire a smoke round, and I may be telling you gentlemen something you already know.
Now this is important because this is going to be watched by a lot of people down through the years. So
Well, so you fire a smoke round to make sure that if you're firing in the wrong place, you're not firing high explosive first and kill the friendly troops. So there was no time. The radio man, because I could hear them ask him, you want first round smoke, because there was a speaker with the radio. I said, no, high explosives, first round, stand by. All three sets of guns asked the same question. We gave the same. I called Bill back. I said, we're just talking like you and I are talking now. Forget call signs and military. It's like we're on a telephone. I said, Bill, I've got three sets of guns ready to fire. And he starts yelling, fire them. I said, Bill, there's no smoke. Fire them. I said, when it hits the ground, start running, I forget which direction, I think it was north, and give me a mark every time you clear 200 yards. So I knew that as we shifted, at least the biggest shells are going to be far enough away. And I said, are you ready? And he's yelling, fire, fire, fire. So I picked up two of the mics. I told the radio man, command, and we yelled, fire, fire, fire. In seconds, you could hear this stuff on its way. And when it started hitting the ground, I mean, we could feel it. It was like an earthquake. My first thought I'd never witnessed that much ordnance hitting the ground. I thought, surely I've just killed my best friend. And so I knew that he understood that he was to be up and running when that first set hit the ground. So now it was waiting. I was waiting to hear his sign that he had covered 200. Can I tell you, it seemed like it was an hour. It was probably 60 seconds. But came the radio message, mark, mark, mark. So we adjusted the fire and then changed it into a line of fire. And I followed him. I told him run into the village that was just north of him. He knew where that was. And I followed that fire, or moved the fire, till he was in the village. Unfortunately, I thought the last set that I'd fired had gone into the village. And I knew these people because as a part of knowing the area was knowing the people. I thought the more people who know me, I'm going to be able to get information. So I knew not only the families, I knew the kids in these villages. And this, in my mind, could turn out to be one of these terrible stories you see on the news. And I had a FAC, forward air controller from the Air Force, a colonel, Colonel Bear, who had been overhead helping me do this intelligently. And he said, 02, I think that last set went into the village. And I didn't sleep all that night. I sat up, I went back, laid in my bunk, tried to sleep. When he left that night, he said, I'll be back at first daylight. I'll let you know. Well, long before daylight, I was standing outside looking over that direction, and I could hear the radio start to crackle, and it was his call sign. So I went in, and I said, so what have you found out? He said, well, I just took off. I'm not there yet, but it was only a matter of minutes for him to get on site. And he said, okay. He said, I see where it all started. He said, it looks like craters on the moon, and he's following. So he said, okay, I'm coming up to the village. He got quiet. He said, 02? He said, I can report 0 rounds into the village. So he thought what had happened the night before, he thought that some of the rounds had gone in and started a fire. Well, he said, I know what I saw last night. He said it was a flare shoot. A flare went into the trees, started the fire. So the emotions that you can go through in any war situation certainly tear at your insides.
Did the team that you were supporting by artillery all survive?
every last one of them. Wow. It was amazing. In fact, that morning, Bill stayed in the village until it was daylight, and we sent trucks out to pick them up. And so when they rolled into the camp, they were coming around slow enough that I could jump up on the running board of the truck. And I said, "So you made it?" And he said, "Yeah, I did."
Wow.
And he said that was some pretty good shooting. But other than that, I mean, there was nothing. There was no, "Oh my God, you know." Mm-hmm. It was just that was, he did his job, I did mine, mm-hmm. and which so many people did over there.
Wow.
Are we okay?
Oh, we're fine.
Okay.
We're fine.
So those are some of the heavy moments. There were light moments, and one of the best ones, I didn't realize that there were so many. I've not thought about this because I wanted whatever we did here today to be spontaneous, but I'd been in country about 3 months, and as I said, we'd built a little kitchen with tables, and I'd even rigged a pull cord that you pull the cord and it would ring a bell in the kitchen, and Pop, the old cook, would come out and, what do you need, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I was working on an operation, and I believe it was the one that took us into the mountains. So I was really focused on it, sitting there at the table, and because we were very close to Nha Trang City, we would receive visitors, senators, dignitaries of every description, and I heard them say, "We'll seat you next to Lieutenant Ross." So somebody sat down, and so I put my pencil down and picked up a tea pitcher that was there and started pouring my tea. And as I did, I glanced over to my left, and there was probably one of the prettiest little blue-eyed blondes I had ever seen in my life. I hadn't seen an American woman in 3 months. Yeah. It was so out of context. I'm trying to think, what is this about? And she said to me, she spoke first, she said, "It's full." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Your glass, it's full." I had poured tea. It was all over the table and running off the table. But these were Red Cross gals. Oh, okay. They had to have a college degree to join this unit, and they would visit forward bases. They visited forward fire bases that were active, unarmed. Truly amazing to me, and extremely generous, and there is nothing that will lift the heart of a soldier, and tired soldiers and dedicated soldiers, more than a visit from an American female. Yeah. And there were, I guess, 3 or 4 of them there that day, and they went all around the camp. We talked to, I took her around and introduced them to people all over the camp. And there was another woman, because at Vietnam it's not like it is now. I have 3 daughters. It would not upset me if one, and there are 2 who would do it in a heartbeat, wanted to slip down into the seat of an F-15 and take to the air to defend her country. Mm-hmm. Why can she not defend her country, but the neighbor boy can defend his country? Yeah. So anyway, well, I'll talk about the other one in a minute.
Now, the mission you just described, was that the Valley of the Taggers?
No.
That was not.
That's coming now.
Okay.
Okay, so one day I'm out riding around between outposts, visiting just, what's going on, what do we need, so on and so forth. And I got a call that from an outpost we called the rock pile, basically, because that's pretty much all it was, that 3 VC had turned themselves in, and they didn't know what to do with them. I said, "I'll be right there." Oh, no, they wanted to turn themselves and their unit in, was the way the message read. So I thought, this is incredible. We got a enemy unit's going to turn itself in. So we got out there, and as soon as I saw the 3 VC, they weren't actually VC at all. They were Montagnard villagers. And Montagnard villagers to me looked very Polynesian. They were beautiful people, big round eyes, dark complected skin, just handsome and beautiful people. But it's three men. And so I happened to have my radio man and bodyguard was a Montagnard. So I find out what the story is here. So he said they had been working in a field. They were actually prisoners of the VC from far out west. We had, one of the Allied units had dropped Chuhoi passes, was what they were called, but they were dropped during the Second World War as well. Turn yourself in, you'll be very well treated, blah, blah, blah. And so these gentlemen found these and thought, okay, here's how we get help for our village. We'll turn ourselves in. So what they wanted us to do was come get their village, bring everybody out, because what the North Vietnamese, this turned out to be a main resupply unit where the village was to the mountain complex that housed the 600 to 700 troops, which were more than a legend. Later on, the Koreans went into this complex with 3,000 soldiers. They ringed the mountain and went from the bottom to the top, and there were 0 prisoners. They killed 700 enemy soldiers in this complex. So they even had a finance division. They had a hospital in this mountain complex. That's how sophisticated, primitive location maybe, but very sophisticated setup and extremely well operated. Anyway, so this Montagnard village, they would use them as pack animals to help carry supplies to the mountain complex. They had them grow corn for food along the way. And so the story unfolded that this guy, the village elder's name was Mung Quang. They kept him tied. They didn't kill him, but kept him tied and caged for, I think, a year and a half in the village. He had rope scars on his arms to go along with his story. And he finally convinced them that, okay, fine, I'm going to play your game. I'd like to work in the fields again. So they told him, fine, we'll let you out. Work in the fields. You must check in 2 days. Come back in, let us know you're here, or we will kill your family, because the families were kept right there in the village. So his story to me was, if I'm not back tomorrow morning, they'll kill my family. It had taken them 2 days to walk to where we were, and that's what he'd done. He immediately bolted. There was no way on the ground that we could get back to where his village was, and at that point, I had no clue where his village was. When I said, asked the interpreter, where's the village? Hoping for some description. It's in a mountain with a hook curve, and we'd know exactly where it was. He pointed out over the jungle and said, it's out there. And so determining where out there was goes back to the interrogation training. I mean, they would tell you, ask basic questions. Did you walk towards the rising sun? Did you walk away from it? Did you do this? Did you do that? And so for about the next hour, we went through that kind of questioning. And I had a pretty good idea where it was, but I knew it was going to be, there was no way we could be there by the next morning. The only way we could get there would be by helicopter. It was extremely mountainous, but based on the description, there were these cornfields that they grew the crops for the North Vietnamese. I thought, we can use those for our LZ. But it was outside of my artillery, or my area of operation. And so the helicopter unit, the 281st, that was assigned to A502 as a support unit, I couldn't order them to go. They tell me to take a hike. So once I had enough information that I felt we could act on it, we got in the Jeep and drove back to camp. This occurred at about 11 o'clock in the morning. It was about noontime when I got back. And the first thing I thought we'd need was a ride. So I called the 281st and started describing our need. And I could tell immediately I was talking to a radio man. And he said, "Can you hold on just a minute?" And I said, "Yes." And then there was another voice. And it turned out to be the commander of this unit. And he said, "So this is a rescue mission, right?" I said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "Maybe 100 people, I don't know, it's an entire village." He said, "I don't need to know more." He said, "Tell me where to be and at what time." It's people like that, again, that you don't hear about. And in 1968, nobody cared that a small group of Americans are going to risk their lives for some mountain people. Anyway, the next morning, they were there, we took off, and as the mist lifted off the jungle, we hit it, and we hit it pretty hard. They rolled in with gunships, also Hueys, but they were armed with miniguns, 20 millimeter cannons, and 50 calibers. I told them, I said, "I'll mark the location." And so as we were flying out, we're looking for these cornfields because we knew that would identify the mountain, the complex, and everything. Finally, we saw them. And so I was on the lead ship, and I told the pilot, I said, "Let's go in and mark it with smoke and then let them tear it up." And that's what we did. But this little mountain villager, now as we took off, he's hanging out the door with me, and I'm pointing to different places. I pointed to the rock pile where he had come in. And so he was an intelligent man. May have been primitive, but bright enough, and his family was out there. He was going to get us there, and he did. So that day we brought out, I guess, 82 people. And that first day, I had the Vietnamese camp commander on board, and he didn't want to land. So now I'm forced to direct this from overhead rather than being on the ground. And so we thought we had everybody. So around 4 in the afternoon, we took off and back to camp, unloaded. They unloaded them. And I took him. I was so excited. Couldn't wait for him to see his family. We got in and we went through all the people. We got to the end of the area where we were holding them, and they weren't there. He collapsed before me like a bowl of jelly, crying, sobbing. They weren't there. I thought, how can this be? I mean, we got everybody that was there. Evidently, some of the families didn't come in, because another key part of this mission was I knew that we were going to go in. I knew that we were going to assault. And I thought, we're going to scare these people to death. They're going to have no idea why we're there. So after I secured the 281st for the ride, I called the Air Force. They had a PSYOPs division that I knew about. And I asked them if they had a speaker plane. Yes, we do. And I said, "Can you do a tape for me?" And they said, "Yes, we can." So I loaded Mong into the Jeep. We drove into the city, and as we were going in, I wrote a script that he would speak. And it was, "This is Mong Quang. This is Mong Quang. I'm here with help. Go to the cornfield on the high hill." And I hoped that that was going to be enough description that they would know where to go. Recorded this. An Air Force pilot, I told him, I said, "I need them to hear this." It was a triple canopy jungle. If you were down in it, you couldn't see an airplane unless you were out on one of these cornfields. You would have thought this guy was part of an old barnstorming troop, because he had one of these O2s, push-pull, and he would roll. He couldn't have been 10 or 15 feet above tree level, and he would follow the contour. I mean, he'd disappear. I thought he'd crash. I kept waiting to see the smoke or leaves or something, and he'd come straight up in the air out of it. So just amazing. I mean, you talk back to the question about what was the morale. These people, and then we're talking about every branch of military service. So we got, I mean, so what do? We don't have this family. I told them, we're going back. The 281st hadn't landed, and I'm on the radio, "Get this guy back." He said, "You want us there the next morning?" My concern was, and it's strange how sometimes you don't fear for your own safety, but my concern was taking these people who were following me, because we got away with it. We were fortunate. The main unit that is normally stationed there was gone. We don't know where they were, but they weren't there. Anyway, now 5th Group Headquarters is getting wind. I got a call that afternoon. We hear there's some kind of rescue going on. What's going on? And so I told them, and immediately, I mean, the CO, 5th Special Forces Group commander in Vietnam, says, this is stuff we've got to get back to the States. And so they said, we're trying to round up a camera crew, blah, blah, blah. And not so fine. So the next morning, everybody shows up, we go back. Now this time, I told the Vietnamese CO, I said, why don't you stay here? And he was a courageous man. It's just, for whatever reason that day, he didn't want to go in. I landed where we had landed, or actually put troops in where we had landed the day before. I landed on another hilltop and then swept over towards the old LZ. And on our way, I mean, this is like stuff you see in war books. We crossed this one creek, and I mean, it was clear and cold, but when I came up on the other side, I had leeches. I mean, you talk about disgusting, all over me. So I sat and pulled the leeches off, and then we got back up into the jungle. As we're going up the trail, your body prepares you to survive. And this was, to me, also something that was very interesting. There would be times when I'd be walking along a trail and the hair on the, now that I talk about it, the hair on the back of my neck's going up. But the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. And as soon as it did, I would snap the safety on my weapon off, because I knew that something, it wasn't in consciousness, but somewhere, one of my senses, either sight or hearing, smell, something was up. And it was never more than a minute that something would happen. Well, on this particular day, the world in front of me blew up. Our point unit made contact, and things are exploding and what. And so I started running forward. I always stationed myself when we were on patrol about 5 to 10 men back, because if you enter what's called a killing zone, if somebody's going to ambush you, it's typically the people in the first part of the unit that are going to be killed, and my job was to survive. Every advisor's job was to survive that initial contact, so that you could call in air support or artillery support, whatever. That's why you were there. Anyway, as I find myself rushing forward, I mean, it's amazing how time will stand still. If you've ever been in a car accident, it's like everything's happening in slow motion. And it's because your brain is trying to take all of this in and sort it out. So the Vietnamese, we were on an incline where water was coming down. It was a slippery trail, and they're trying to get down and back, and I'm trying to get forward. And as I'm going forward in all of this, there's enough time to think, have the thought, you're going the wrong way. You should be going the other way with them. But it is what you're trained to do. So we made it up the trail. We found we were in the main village. Nobody was there, but we destroyed caches of enemy supplies and weapons, moved on to the LZ, and as we're going up, we came out of the jungle onto this cornfield. There is a huge rock, and there was a woman with 2 children sitting there. And I reached over and I grabbed him by the back of his shirt and I pulled Mang Quang over. I did my arm like that. And he looked back at me, and there was this instant smile on his face. So I knew we'd found his family. So that day, I think we got 60. A week later, we had to go back because there were still other families. Ultimately, we brought out 160 people. And on that third day, when I went out to the LZ, our LZ, the Camp LZ, I noticed the public information for 5th Special Forces getting off the front helicopter. I said, what are you doing? This is not a Hollywood shoot. He said, go look on the front chopper. And it was filled with media. And a CBS camera crew was on board, a female from, I forget which paper she wrote for. And so they were going to cover the operation that day. The female, I told her, I said, you have to, Sue will love this one. I said, you have to stay here. I can't take you out there. She said, what do you mean you can't take me out there? She said, I'm a reporter just like them. I said, I'm concerned for your safety. Now, these guys are all standing around listening for this. She's very bright and very quick. She said, so you're not worried about their safety? I said, well, yes, I'm worried about their safety. But I said, look, I grew up in the South. We treat women like ladies and da-da-da. She took a stance, stomped her foot down. She said, Lieutenant, I'm no Southern belle. I said, well, that may be, but you got to stay. Everybody on the helicopters. I told her, I said, you know, we've got so many people up here. You can go start covering the story ahead of these guys, talk to the villagers. I'll give you an interpreter block. So last I saw her, she was walking off. I jumped on the front chopper and told them, let's go. So we get out to the LZ, I land, and we get enough people in that it's secure. I said, bring the press chopper in. When it came in, I flipped my collar up, turned my back, and it lifts off to go over my head, and when I turned around, there she stood. So I went up, and I said, I can call that chopper back in, and I will put you on it. She said, are you? I said, if you'll stay by this rock. And she stayed. So ultimately, this story was told on the morning news, the afternoon news, and the evening news with Walter Cronkite. Wow. And I only recently noticed, as they're showing part of this, you can see her standing there. It's a tall brunette with short chopped hair. She has a camera hanging around her neck and a pad and pencil. Every other man on that drop LZ had a weapon and lots of ammunition. So for me, my time in Vietnam was a privilege. One, to serve this country. Two, to serve with the people I served with. And three, to see the kinds of things, the bravery, the courage, the selfless acts that I was able to witness.
Well, you not only witnessed it, you participated. I mean, your bravery and your intuition
to do those things.
Saved a lot of lives, I'm sure.
Can only hope.
When did you come back to the States?
I was there all of 1968. I got back in time for Christmas of 1968. Okay. And my parents, my mother once called me in Vietnam. She hadn't heard from me in a couple weeks, called the Red Cross. I was at one of our river camps. I mean, this is, you talk, and the parents of people who go to serve, you know, have their own level of courage. Anyway, she called the Red Cross, told them she hadn't heard from me in 2 weeks. So some guy, she got as far as Saigon, some Red Cross worker in Saigon called on a landline at the camp, and one of the camp soldiers said, your mother's on the phone. Here I am. I'm on the other side of the world. I'm a Green Beret, and my mother wants to talk to me. I went to the phone. It wasn't my mother, but it was this Red Cross guy. He said, look, he said, I told her I couldn't put her through to the camp, but are you okay? I said, yes. And he said, well, your mother hasn't received a letter in 2 weeks. I said, tell my mother that I've been on a 2-week long-range patrol and that I am okay. So that was the kind of mom I had. Yeah. And so she wanted to have a parade for me when I got home in Pensacola, and she would have had. She had hired, she said, I've already arranged with, there was a place called Rosie O'Grady's Bar in Pensacola, and she was going to have that Dixieland band. So consequently, I told my parents I would be home 2 weeks later than I actually got home. So when the plane landed in Birmingham, I called home, and she answered. And I said, you got a place for a tired soldier to lay down? And it was, oh my God, where are you? I said, I'm in Birmingham. Because I knew, as skilled as she was, she couldn't organize a parade in 30 minutes. So I got home. I was part of the family business for about 13 years, collected a handful of college degrees, and felt the need to play in the corporate world. Was recruited to 2 of the largest jewelry companies in the world. Then, after I'd played the corporate game, decided, to refound the family business here in Atlanta, and And that's what I did.
And you stayed in the Army Reserve for quite a few years too, didn't you?
I stayed, yes, I would go. I didn't stay for the retirement. I wanted to be available in case there was a national emergency. And because of my training, I mean, I knew the job. I knew how to do it. I liked doing it. When I left Vietnam, I could see where it was all headed. And at that point, soldiers were starting to become disillusioned. We weren't going to be allowed to win that war. And we weren't going to be allowed to do the things that we needed to do to win that war. It's like fighting in your neighborhood where your neighbors can run into your yard, punch you in the nose, and then run them back across the property line, and you can't chase them unless you sneak across. So anyway, it's been, since Vietnam, a very different life. People who know me, because I don't talk about it unless somehow it comes up. I did the book. I felt compelled as well to do the book because when I came back, I couldn't believe when I was told that Americans were spitting on the uniforms of American soldiers. To me, it was a thought I couldn't grasp. And so I sat down within 2 weeks of returning and wrote the first few chapters and the entire outline for the book, and then waited 20-some years to publish it because this country wasn't ready for a positive story about service in Vietnam.
Have you completed the book?
The book was out in 2004, and it's called Privileges of War.
Well, I definitely want to read that.
Well, go out and get one. I've got it in the car for you. One for you, too. And one for you, Sue.
I'm going to give you a chance to just say anything in closing you'd like to, but before I do that, I want to be sure I give Ed and Sue a chance to ask any questions that they have.
I have absolutely no questions.
One remarkable story that I didn't tell was the courage of a young man from Atlanta, Georgia. And with the Atlanta Historical Society right here, it's a story that should be told. Every incoming Special Forces soldier would spend 3 days at my camp training. We'd send them out on a live, they do training in the city, then come out to the camp for a live mission. We'd send them out either on a patrol or an ambush, and this unit was going to be an ambush. I would give a briefing before each unit left. As a part of that briefing, there were things I would caution them to do, especially new incoming troops would have this gung-ho spirit, especially Special Forces people who a portion of John Wayne lived inside. And I would tell them there's, among other things, but the key thing is you're going on a night ambush. You'll be with the other Vietnamese soldiers. Do not trigger the ambush unless you have no other option. Because if you're laying on ambush and an enemy unit is approaching, now I'm going to put you on the enemy soldier's side of this scenario. If you're walking into an ambush and somebody shoots at you, there's going to be a muzzle flash. It's going to look like a flash camera. Where are you going to return fire? Are you going to shoot over there, up there? No, you're going to return fire at that muzzle flash because that is the danger. So that's why you don't do it. Fine. Everybody got it. Well, this one particular soldier was a red-haired young guy. And after the meeting, I went over, he was putting on camouflage. Turns out his name is Dale Reich, graduated from Grady, was the captain of the Grady High School football team. And he was putting on his camouflage. And in my head, he's getting ready for the game. Put the smudge, it's like what football players did. And so we talked. I said, you got everything? Yep, absolutely, And we talked a little more about home, and we were both from the South. And he went out that night. It's another one of these 1 o'clock in the morning scenarios. The radio man came and woke me up. Lieutenant Ross, the new unit is in contact. Got on the radio and asked for a status report and got the report that there were so many Vietnamese killed, a couple wounded, one American KIA'd. I couldn't let that sit. And I knew that the medic who was with him was also a new guy, so I was hoping maybe he can't find the pulse. Called for a medevac to go get him. They said, "Is your unit still in contact?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "We can't go as long as they're in contact." I said, "What if I have him move to a more secure location?" He said, "We're not going to know, exactly how to find blah, blah, blah." I said, "What if I go with you and show you?" And this is again where I was talking to a radio man. All of a sudden there's a silence, new voice. It's the pilot who would fly the mission. He said, "So you can he said, "if I come out there, you can take me somewhere I'm not going to get shot at while I go in to bring out your man." I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Go get on your pad. We'll be there in 10 minutes. They came, picked me up. We went out. As soon as they put him on the chopper, as soon as I touched him, I knew he was gone. He was already cold, not a mark on him. I looked everywhere for the wound, but what had happened, people next to him told me, another company-size unit came in on them. The point came right through a stand of brush and were there. He saw them, stood up, opened fire. He was laying in the prone position, shot him in the mouth, went the length of his body, and killed him instantly. His memorial, there is a memorial behind what used to be First Union Bank downtown. It's at Peachtree and 10th, I think. And so now occasionally I put flags on that memorial.
Good.
So,
What was his name?
Dale Reich, R-E-I-C-H, graduated from Swanee. And I just recently, I've been looking for his son for years. When the book was coming out, I tell that story in the book. You'll be able to read it. I will give you those books. I wanted the family to know that that story was going to be in there by some freak coincidence that they might see it. Yeah. And his son is a chaplain, and they're stationed in Alaska.
How about that?
Yeah.
Wow.
So.
Who put the memorial up?
Where is it?
No, who put it up?
Are you all part of the Atlanta Vietnam?
We are.
Veteran?
We're both members.
We did it.
So that's the one of the memorials
Yeah.
that we put up.
Yeah. In fact, you all, that's how I found out you all existed, was I was looking for the family. I was looking for the son, and somehow got connected with you folks. And
That's what I thought.
yeah.
Well, I tell you, your story is an inspiration, but you're an inspiration, and I wish we could play this for a lot of Americans. I mean, your incentive for going into the Army after seeing on TV that young soldier being carried away by two other soldiers, and all the way to the way you dealt with the artillery unit going out there, which I'm sure a lot of people didn't, going out there and showing your support for them and doing a lot of things you did not have to do for them personally, is a real inspiration. And you obviously were and are a leader, but what you did from the standpoint of courage, number one, but leadership, number two, and the rescue of those Vietnamese,
I wasn't alone, though. I couldn't have done that. Had that helicopter unit not stepped up, and those guys, Jim Talbert, was a part of the 281st.
Okay.
I think, I'm not sure he was in on that particular mission, but these guys, I mean, I could sit, if we had that bottle of scotch, I could do this all day long, because I was so inspired. I mean, it was just amazing, but this country doesn't know those stories. Look at you all. I mean, there is this stereotype of the guy who's living under the bridge is a Vietnam veteran. Yeah. You two guys look pretty clean cut to me, intelligent, successful. I mean, look at the people in that organization. Now, because of the way my business, I can't get out to do, I mean, I'd love to do the luncheons. I did a few in the beginning, but the other thing is, and I attribute it to the Montagnards, gave me what I needed not to have nightmares. I've never had my wife will tell you, I sleep like a baby when I lay down, but I mentioned in the beginning that I wanted to do something good, didn't know how it would happen, how it would manifest itself. God gave me that gift to do the Montagnard thing.
Well, I can't think of a better way to close the interview, and I just want to thank you for coming in here and sharing your story, and
My
thank you for
pleasure.
your service.
And the same to you two gentlemen.
Thank you.